I climbed into an old grain bin to escape the heat. A widow said, "My grandson wants me declared unfit." Marisol Kavanagh had $8, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools she'd carried since her last steady job on a grain storage maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any old grain bin she passed for shelter from the heat. A habit that had led her, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten structure that kept her cool for a few hours at a stretch. She was 21 years old, laid off 7 months earlier when the regional cooperative that employed her consolidated its storage maintenance into a single traveling crew, eliminating her entire local position in a single afternoon. She had been moving through farm country ever since, taking whatever short-term work she could find. The consolidation notice had cited operational efficiency as its justification, language Marisol had come to recognize across 7 months of towns exactly like this one, as the specific corporate dialect for deciding that a technician's actual familiarity with a particular cooperative's specific storage equipment mattered less than whatever a traveling crew could theoretically manage across several counties instead. She had grown up around grain storage her whole life, her own father having maintained bins and elevators for nearly 3 decades before her, and she had learned, riding along on his service calls from an early age, to read a structure's condition the way another person might read a familiar face. The heat that particular afternoon had climbed well past anything Marisol found comfortable walking through, and she climbed into the nearest grain bin she could find, its interior considerably cooler than the baking road outside, grateful simply for shade and stillness after hours of relentless sun. She had barely settled into the bin's shadowed interior when she realized she wasn't alone. An elderly woman sat against the curved metal wall, a folder of papers held loosely in her lap, her expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been sitting with difficult thoughts far longer than was doing her any good. "I didn't mean to intrude," Marisol said. "I saw the bin and needed somewhere out of the heat. I'll go if you'd rather." "You're not intruding," the woman said, looking up with more weariness than alarm. "Name's Marguerite Thistlewood. This farm's been mine since my husband passed 3 years back. I've just learned my own grandson wants me declared unfit to manage my own affairs, a guardianship petition he's apparently already filed with the county." "Why would he do that?" Marisol asked. "Money, I suspect, though he hasn't been honest enough with me directly to confirm it," Marguerite said. "Corbin's had considerable debts these past 2 years, from what I've gathered secondhand rather than anything he's told me himself. If he gains guardianship over my affairs, he gains control of this farm, which he could then sell to cover whatever he actually owes." "How did you learn about the petition?" Marisol asked. "A county clerk I've known for years happened to mention it, assuming I already knew," Marguerite said. "I don't think Corbin ever intended for me to find out until it was already decided. I imagine he expected the process to simply proceed quietly, with the judge accepting whatever concerned account he presented without my own competing perspective ever properly entering the record." Over the following hour, sheltering together from the afternoon heat, Marguerite told Marisol the fuller story of exactly how her own grandson had come to petition for control over her life. Corbin had visited more frequently over the past year, initially seeming like simple, renewed family closeness, gradually revealing itself as reconnaissance for exactly this kind of petition, noting every small forgotten name or misplaced object as evidence he apparently intended to present as proof of her declining competency. I remember him asking more than once whether I'd taken my medication that day, questions that felt caring at the time but that I now understand were likely building a case rather than expressing genuine concern, Marguerite said. I don't know when exactly his visit stopped being about me and started being about what he could eventually gain from convincing a court I could no longer manage on my own. "I forget things sometimes," Marguerite admitted. "I misplace my glasses, forget a neighbor's name I've known for decades, the ordinary forgetfulness of a woman my age. I don't believe that makes me incapable of managing my own farm, whatever Corbyn's petition claims about my supposed decline. Have you seen a doctor recently? Someone who could formally assess your competency properly? Marisol asked. Not specifically for this purpose, Marguerite said. I don't have the resources to arrange an independent evaluation on short notice, and I don't know how to properly counter his petition without one. Marisol spent the following days doing the only thing she knew how to do with what little she had. She helped Marguerite arrange exactly the kind of independent evaluation her situation genuinely required, understanding that simply denying the petition's claims wasn't a sufficient strategy against a formal legal filing that would eventually need to be answered with real evidence. They contacted a rural legal aid attorney the following morning, a careful man named Foster Cray, whose name Marisol recognized from stories she'd heard traveling through other farm counties. And Cray listened to Marguerite's account with evident concern once he understood the full situation. This is a pattern I've unfortunately seen before, Cray told them. A family member escalates concern into formal guardianship, based on ordinary signs of aging rather than genuine incapacity. Often driven by financial motives, the petition itself never acknowledges directly. I'd recommend arranging an independent competency evaluation immediately from a physician with no connection to your grandson whatsoever, to directly counter whatever claims his petition makes. How quickly can such an evaluation actually happen? Marguerite asked, her voice carrying the particular urgency of someone who had already lost too many days to fear before finally seeking proper help. I know a geriatric specialist who owes me a favor from a previous case, Cray said. I'll call this afternoon. Given the circumstances, I expect she'll make time within the week, understanding exactly how much depends on a prompt, properly documented assessment. Cray arranged an appointment with a geriatric specialist the following week, and the evaluation, conducted thoroughly and independently, confirmed Marguerite's full mental competency, finding no evidence whatsoever of the significant cognitive decline Corbyn's petition had claimed. The specialist's own report noted, specifically, that Marguerite demonstrated clear, consistent reasoning throughout a battery of standard cognitive assessments, directly contradicting the pattern of confusion Corbyn's petition had described in considerable and evidently exaggerated detail. It was while gathering additional documentation for the formal response that Marisol, helping Marguerite search through old farm records for anything that might further support her case, discovered a folder of collection notices addressed to Corbyn himself, apparently delivered to the farmhouse by mistake given his own address had recently changed, revealing debts considerably more substantial than Marguerite had previously understood. This confirms exactly what I suspected, Marguerite said, reading through the notices with a mixture of sadness and vindication. He's not concerned about my welfare at all. He needs this farm's value to cover debts he's never once been honest with me about. How much does he owe, based on what these notices show? Marisol asked. Considerably more than I'd have imagined, Marguerite said, her voice tight with a fresh wave of hurt layered over the earlier anger. I don't know what he's been spending on, whether gambling or some failed venture or simply poor decisions compounding over time. I only know he apparently decided my own farm was the easiest solution available to him, rather than admitting his troubles to me directly and asking for help the honest way. This documentation, combined with the independent evaluation, should leave the court very little room to take his petition seriously. Cray told them, once he'd reviewed everything together. I'll file our formal response immediately, presenting both pieces of evidence plainly. The hearing proceeded within the following month, and Cray presented the independent evaluation alongside the collection notices with methodical precision, painting a picture of financial motive that left Corbyn's own attorney struggling to maintain any semblance of the petition's original narrative about genuine welfare concern. Your own client's financial circumstances appear considerably more relevant to this petition than any genuine concern about his grandmother's competency, the judge observed, reviewing both pieces of evidence directly. I find no reasonable basis to grant guardianship here, and I'm dismissing this petition in its entirety. Corbin did not contest the ruling further, and the collection notice's unintended discovery apparently forced him to finally confront his own financial situation directly, rather than continuing to pursue a solution built on his own grandmother's manufactured incompetency. I don't know how to describe what it feels like, after weeks of fearing my own grandson might have me declared incapable of managing my own life, to finally have proof in writing that I'm entirely capable. Marguerite told Marisol, once the petition's dismissal was confirmed. I'd nearly convinced myself that ordinary forgetfulness might genuinely cost me everything I've built. You were never actually incompetent, Marisol said. You were simply an aging woman whose grandson decided that ordinary aging was convenient grounds for something considerably more self-serving than genuine concern. She paused a moment before continuing. I think the hardest part of a betrayal like this one is that it comes wrapped in the language of care, making it considerably harder to recognize for what it actually is until someone finally names it plainly. That's precisely it, Marguerite said. I spent weeks doubting my own judgment, wondering whether Corbin's concern was genuine, and I was simply too proud to accept help I might actually need. It took finding those collection notices to finally understand the concern was never real to begin with. Marisol stayed on with Marguerite through that winter, and the ones that followed, the grain bin that had first given her an afternoon shelter from the heat becoming gradually something closer to a shared landmark than either of them had expected when a stranger first climbed inside to escape a punishing summer sun. She spent that first year helping Marguerite manage the farm's own daily operations, work that gave the older woman renewed confidence in exactly the kind of independent capability Corbin's petition had tried to dispute, and found herself, gradually, becoming a steady presence in a household that had nearly lost to a single manufactured claim, the independence Marguerite had spent her whole adult life building and protecting. Marguerite, in turn, began speaking more openly with neighbors and old friends about what had happened, no longer needing to carry the quiet fear and shame she'd felt during those first uncertain weeks after learning of the petition. I used to think family loyalty meant giving Corbin the benefit of every doubt. However, his behavior actually struck me at the time, Marguerite admitted, one evening that winter. I understand now that loyalty and blindness aren't the same thing, whatever I once assumed. I think my husband would have wanted me to see that distinction clearly, rather than excusing away every warning sign simply because it came from someone I loved. My husband would have been glad to know somebody finally stood with me against Corbin's particular kind of pressure, Marguerite told Marisol one evening, the two of them sitting together in her own kitchen, warm and well lit in a way that felt, finally, entirely safe. He always said family was supposed to protect what mattered most, not exploit ordinary aging the moment opportunity presented itself. I think he'd have been glad about more than just the petition's dismissal, Marisol said. I think he'd have been glad you didn't have to face those weeks of fear entirely alone, uncertain whether anyone would actually believe you over your own grandson's version of events. Marisol wrote to her own mother that winter, describing the grain bin and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine search for shade to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose she'd feared she might never find again after the consolidation ended her own storage maintenance career. Her reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way Marisol remembered growing up with. Your grandfather always said the right kind of stranger shows up exactly when a person stopped expecting anyone to. Sounds like you found your way into exactly that kind of story, on exactly the hottest afternoon you needed to. Marisol thought, some evenings that winter, about the 7 months of towns and consolidation notices that had led her to a shaded grain bin on an ordinary sweltering afternoon, and understood, watching Marguerite move through her own farmhouse with a confidence that had barely existed the day they'd met, that she had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose her own father had modeled decades before she was old enough to understand it. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of arriving, entirely by chance, on exactly the afternoon a frightened widow most needed somebody willing to help her prove the truth before a fabricated claim could ever become official. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many aging widows face the particular threat of having ordinary forgetfulness weaponized against them by family members who've decided guardianship is easier than genuine care, or considerably more profitable than honesty about their own financial troubles? And what does it take? A stranger seeking shade from the heat, an independent evaluation arranged in time, an attorney willing to formally challenge what a petition too easily assumed was true. For that threat to finally be exposed as nothing more than self-interest dressed up as concern. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.